Charles Whitmore stepped off the private jet with an air of superiority, his designer sunglasses shielding his eyes from the bright London sun. Clad in an expensive tailored suit, he exuded confidence, perhaps too much of it. Beside him, his wife, Laura, clutched her designer handbag tightly, looking slightly uncomfortable as she adjusted to the unfamiliar surroundings. Their teenage daughter, Emily, trailed behind, scrolling through her phone, seemingly uninterested in the historic city they had just landed in. This trip was supposed to be the vacation of a lifetime, a chance for Charles to flaunt his wealth and sophistication on foreign soil. He had booked the most luxurious accommodations, reserved tables at Michelin-starred restaurants, and planned visits to all the iconic landmarks. For Charles, this wasn't just about sightseeing. It was about proving something. To whom, exactly, wasn't clear, not even to himself. But he carried an unshakable belief that his money made him better than everyone else. Their first stop was Buckingham Palace, a place Charles insisted they visit because, as he put it, that's where the real power is. As their chauffeur-driven car pulled up near the palace gates, Charles leaned forward, staring out the window with a smirk. The grandeur of the building impressed him, but what caught his attention were the royal guards standing outside. Dressed in their striking red tunics and tall bearskin hats, they stood perfectly still, like statues brought to life. "Look at them," Charles said, pointing toward the guards with a chuckle. "They're just standing there like mannequins. What's the point? Do they even move?" His tone dripped with mockery, and Laura gave him a sharp look, silently urging him to tone it down. Emily rolled her eyes, used to her father's condescending remarks. As they approached the palace grounds, Charles couldn't help but comment on everything around him. He criticized the size of the crowd. So many tourists ruining the view. Complained about the strict rules barring people from getting too close to the guards. What's the big deal? It's not like they bite. And sneered at the uniforms. Honestly, who wears those hats anymore? Every word out of his mouth seemed calculated to belittle or provoke. Laura tried to intervene, reminding him that they were guests in another country and should show respect. But Charles brushed her off, saying, "Respect has to be earned. These guys aren't doing anything special. They're just standing there." The tension grew thicker as they joined the line of tourists waiting to take photos near the guards. Charles grew increasingly agitated when security personnel politely reminded visitors not to cross certain boundaries. He muttered under his breath, calling the rules stupid and rolling his eyes dramatically. When someone accidentally bumped into him, he snapped, "Watch where you're going," without realizing how rude he sounded. What no one knew yet was that beneath Charles's polished exterior lay simmering prejudices. He often dismissed people based on their appearance or background, though he rarely voiced these thoughts openly. Today, however, surrounded by strangers in a foreign land, his true colors began to show. And as fate would have it, those colors were about to clash violently with the dignity of the very institution he claimed to admire. Little did Charles know, his actions in the next few moments would change his life forever, and not in the way he imagined. As Charles stood near the royal guards, his irritation reached a boiling point. The crowd around him buzzed with excitement, snapping photos and marveling at the iconic scene before them. But Charles wasn't impressed. To him, the whole setup felt like a waste of time. He couldn't understand why people were so fascinated by men who barely moved or spoke. "They're not even doing anything," he muttered loudly enough for those nearby to hear. Some tourists glanced at him, eyebrows raised, but most ignored his grumbling and continued enjoying the moment. Laura tugged gently on his sleeve, trying to steer him away from the growing tension. "Let's just take our pictures and go," she whispered, her voice laced with urgency. But Charles shrugged her off, his pride wounded by the idea of being told what to do, especially by his wife. Emily, sensing the brewing storm, stepped back slightly, pretending to focus on her phone. She knew better than to get involved when her father was in one of his moods. The guard nearest to Charles stood tall and stoic, his face expressionless despite the commotion around him. His uniform was impeccable, every detail perfectly in place, from the gleaming buttons on his coat to the spotless white gloves covering his hands. To most people, he represented tradition, discipline, and honor. But to Charles, he was nothing more than a symbol of everything that annoyed him about this trip, a rigid system that demanded respect without earning it, in his opinion. "What are you even here for?" Charles blurted out, addressing the guard directly. The man didn't respond, trained to remain silent and focused no matter what happened. This only infuriated Charles further. "Can you even hear me?" he asked, his voice rising. When there was still no reaction, Charles turned to the small group of onlookers nearby and sneered, "Guess they don't teach them how to talk, ha?" His comments drew a few uncomfortable chuckles from some tourists, but others looked away, clearly uneasy. One elderly woman shook her head disapprovingly, while a young couple exchanged glances, silently agreeing to move farther away from the volatile American. Even Laura seemed embarrassed, her cheeks flushing red as she pleaded with Charles under her breath to stop making a scene. But Charles wasn't listening. Something about the guard's unwavering composure struck a nerve deep inside him. Maybe it was the way the man refused to acknowledge him, standing tall and dignified despite the insults. Or maybe it was the subtle reminder of authority that Charles despised, a figure who represented order and structure in a world Charles thought he could control with his wealth. And then, almost instinctively, Charles noticed something about the guard that pushed him over the edge. The guard's skin tone. It wasn't pale like his own. Instead, it carried a warm richness that hinted at a heritage different from what Charles considered normal. In that moment, a thought crossed Charles's mind, one he would later regret but couldn't suppress. Under his breath, he muttered, "Probably thinks he's better than us because of where he comes from." Though the comment was quiet, it didn't go unnoticed. A middle-aged man standing nearby shot Charles a sharp look, clearly offended by the remark. Another tourist, a young woman holding a camera, frowned deeply and took a step back, shaking her head in disbelief. Even Laura froze, staring at her husband with wide eyes, unable to believe what she had just heard. For a brief second, Charles caught himself. He realized how ugly his words sounded, even to him. But instead of apologizing or walking away, he doubled down, fueled by a mix of anger and defensiveness. "What? Am I wrong?" He snapped at the man who had glared at him. The man didn't respond, but the disapproval in his eyes said everything. Charles's heart raced now, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He felt cornered, judged, and ridiculed, all things he hated. Without thinking, his gaze shifted to a cluster of paint cans left behind by street artists who had been painting murals earlier that day. An idea began to form in his mind, reckless and impulsive, and before anyone could stop him, Charles made a decision that would change not only his life, but also the lives of everyone watching. Charles's eyes locked onto the paint cans sitting unattended near the edge of the crowd. They were leftovers from street artists who had been adding color to the city earlier that day, their vibrant hues now abandoned in favor of fresh attractions like Buckingham Palace. To Charles, those cans suddenly seemed less like art supplies and more like tools for revenge, a way to assert dominance over the situation and humiliate the guard whose stoic presence had infuriated him. Without hesitation, he strode toward the cans, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. His family watched in stunned silence as he bent down, picked up a can of bright red paint, and shook it with exaggerated force. The metallic rattle cut through the murmurs of the crowd, drawing attention from all directions. Tourists turned their heads, cameras paused mid-snap, and even some of the guards shifted ever so slightly, though their faces remained impassive. "What are you doing?" Laura hissed, her voice trembling with panic. She reached out to grab his arm, but Charles shrugged her off again, this time with more force. "Stay out of this," he growled, not bothering to look at her. Emily took another step back, clutching her phone tightly, unsure whether to record or run away entirely. With the paint can in hand, Charles marched back to where the guard stood, still motionless, still dignified. He stopped just inches away from the boundary line, marked by ropes and barriers, staring up at the towering figure before him. For a moment, there was an eerie quiet, broken only by the distant chatter of tourists and the faint rustle of wind. Then, without warning, Charles popped open the lid of the can and tilted it forward. Bright red paint spilled out in a thick stream, splashing across the guard's pristine uniform. It dripped down the gleaming buttons, pooled on the white gloves, and stained the once immaculate bearskin hat. Gasps erupted from the crowd as people realized what was happening. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others instinctively raised their phones to capture the spectacle unfolding before them. Children clung to their parents, wide-eyed and confused. The guard did not flinch, not even a twitch. His training held firm, his body rooted in place despite the humiliation coursing down his chest. To anyone watching, his composure was nothing short of extraordinary, a testament to discipline and honor. But to Charles, it felt like mockery. How could someone remain so calm while being openly disrespected? It enraged him further, fueling his need to dominate the situation. "There," Charles exclaimed, tossing the empty can aside with a dramatic flourish. Paint smeared across his own hands and cuffs, but he didn't care. Instead, he grinned smugly, turning to face the crowd as if expecting applause. "Now that's something worth talking about," he declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Bet you'll remember me now." His words hung in the air, met with stunned silence. No one laughed. No one cheered. Instead, the atmosphere shifted dramatically, filling with palpable tension. People began whispering among themselves, shaking their heads in disbelief. A few brave souls stepped forward, glaring at Charles with undisguised disgust. One elderly man muttered, "You should be ashamed of yourself," loud enough for those nearby to hear. Others nodded in agreement, their expressions hardening. Laura looked mortified, her face pale as she whispered, "We need to leave. Right now." But Charles either didn't hear her or chose to ignore her. He basked in the chaos he had created, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. Security personnel stationed nearby exchanged urgent glances before radioing for backup. Within moments, 2 officers approached cautiously, their voices firm but measured as they instructed Charles to come with them. For the first time since the incident began, Charles faltered. The weight of what he had done started to sink in, but it was too late to undo it. As the officers escorted him away, the crowd parted like waves, leaving him isolated and exposed. Behind him, the guard remained standing tall, a symbol of resilience amidst the madness. And somewhere in the distance, a young woman pressed upload on her phone, sending videos of the shocking scene spiraling into the digital world. The moment Charles was led away by security, the crowd erupted into a mix of gasps, murmurs, and outright condemnation. People who had been quietly observing the scene just minutes earlier now turned their full attention to the spectacle unfolding before them. Smartphones were held high, capturing every detail as the officers escorted Charles toward a nearby holding area. His once smug demeanor had faded, replaced by a flicker of unease as he realized the gravity of what he had done. But it was too late. His actions were already immortalized in countless videos and photos. Within hours, those recordings began flooding social media platforms. The bright red paint dripping down the guard's uniform made for a striking visual that caught the eye of millions around the world. Captions like "Entitled Tourist Humiliates Royal Guard" and "American Man Loses It at Buckingham Palace" dominated headlines on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Viewers were quick to share their outrage, with many calling Charles's behavior disrespectful, childish, and downright cruel. Some even dug deeper, speculating about his background and wealth based on snippets of information shared by eyewitnesses. Back at the palace gates, the mood remained tense. Laura and Emily stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Their faces burned with shame as strangers whispered behind their backs, pointing fingers and shaking their heads. Laura tried to shield her daughter from the growing hostility, but it was impossible to escape. Emily, meanwhile, looked close to tears, clutching her phone tightly as notifications poured in from friends who had seen the viral posts online. "Mom, everyone's talking about us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are we going to do?" As the day wore on, news outlets picked up the story, amplifying its reach far beyond London. Journalists scrambled to piece together details about Charles Whitmore, uncovering bits of his life that painted an unflattering picture. His history of arrogance, his tendency to belittle service staff, and rumors of past incidents involving entitlement and poor behavior. One report highlighted an anonymous source claiming Charles often boasted about using his money to get away with anything. These revelations only fueled public anger, turning him into a global symbol of unchecked privilege. Meanwhile, the Royal Guard, whose name was later revealed to be Amir Patel, became an unexpected hero. Interviews with palace officials revealed that Amir had joined the Royal Guard Corps to honor his family's legacy of service and dedication. Despite facing racism and prejudice throughout his career, he had risen above it all, earning respect through his hard work and commitment. When asked how he managed to stay composed during such a humiliating ordeal, Amir simply said, "I represent something bigger than myself. My duty is to my country, not to react to insults." Amir's quiet strength resonated deeply with people worldwide. Supporters rallied around him, praising his professionalism and dignity under pressure. Hashtags like #RespectForAmir and #StandWithTheGuard trended globally, with thousands sharing messages of admiration. Even celebrities chimed in, condemning Charles's actions while applauding Amir's resilience. For many, Amir represented everything good about humanity: grace, perseverance, and humility. But for Charles, the backlash was relentless. Backlash came not only from strangers, but also from acquaintances and business associates who distanced themselves almost immediately. Calls and emails poured into his office, canceling deals and partnerships. Friends stopped responding to messages, and invitations to exclusive events dried up overnight. Worst of all, footage of his racist remarks surfaced, further tarnishing his reputation. What started as a single act of defiance spiraled into a full-blown crisis, leaving Charles isolated and scrambling to defend himself. By the end of the day, Charles found himself sitting alone in a holding cell, staring blankly at the cold, gray walls. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like never before. He thought about his wife and daughter, wondering if they would ever forgive him, or if he deserved forgiveness. Outside, the world continued to move forward, debating and dissecting every aspect of the incident. For Charles, however, time seemed to stand still, much like the very guard he had mocked earlier that day. The legal consequences for Charles Whitmore began almost immediately, and they hit him like a freight train. After spending an uncomfortable night in a holding cell, he was formally charged with multiple offenses, including vandalism, public disorder, and racial harassment. The courtroom became the next stage of his public downfall, where every detail of his actions and his personality was laid bare for scrutiny. During the trial, prosecutors painted a damning picture of Charles as a man who believed himself above the law, using his wealth and privilege to justify appalling behavior. Footage from the scene at Buckingham Palace was played repeatedly, showing not only the moment he poured paint on Amir Patel, but also his earlier racially tinged comments. Witnesses testified about how his attitude had shifted from irritation to outright hostility, culminating in the shocking act that made headlines worldwide. One witness even recounted overhearing Charles mutter, "These people think they're better than us," before grabbing the paint can, a remark that sent shockwaves through the packed courtroom. Charles's defense team tried to argue that his actions were impulsive, born out of frustration rather than malice. They claimed he didn't mean to cause harm or offend anyone, framing the incident as a regrettable mistake rather than a calculated insult. But their arguments fell flat when faced with overwhelming evidence of his arrogance and prejudice. Even Laura, called to testify under subpoena, struggled to defend him. Her testimony revealed cracks in their marriage, hinting at years of enabling his bad behavior because she feared confrontation. When asked directly if Charles had ever expressed similar views in private, she hesitated before admitting, "He has. Opinions. Strong ones." As the days dragged on, the financial toll mounted. Legal fees piled up faster than Charles could pay them, draining his once bottomless bank account. His flashy lifestyle, private jets, luxury cars, and penthouse suites vanished overnight. Creditors came knocking, seizing assets to cover mounting debts. Business partners who had once kissed up to him now avoided his calls altogether, unwilling to associate with someone so deeply disgraced. By the time the judge delivered the verdict, Charles was already teetering on the brink of ruin. The sentence was harsh but fair: hefty fines, mandatory community service, and a permanent ban from returning to the United Kingdom. The judge emphasized that Charles's actions weren't just an attack on one individual, but an affront to the values of respect and dignity upheld by institutions like the Royal Guard Court. "Your behavior reflects poorly not only on yourself but on your country," the judge declared sternly. "It is my hope that you use this experience to reflect on the harm caused by prejudice and entitlement." Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed relentlessly as reporters shouted questions at Charles. Gone was the confident swagger he had displayed at Buckingham Palace. Instead, he shuffled past the crowd with his head bowed, flanked by lawyers who looked equally defeated. For the first time in his life, Charles felt truly powerless. There were no assistants to smooth things over, no connections to pull strings, and certainly no escape from the avalanche of consequences bearing down on him. Back home, the fallout continued. Neighbors stopped waving hello, embarrassed to be associated with someone labeled a global embarrassment. Local businesses posted signs refusing to serve him, citing concerns about backlash from other customers. Even online, trolls bombarded his social media profiles with hateful messages, mocking his downfall and calling him everything from racist Karen to entitled clown. Charles deleted his accounts, unable to stomach the endless ridicule. For Laura and Emily, life became unbearable too. Friends distanced themselves, whispering behind closed doors about what kind of family would enable such behavior. Emily begged her mother to let her transfer schools after classmates mocked her relentlessly, sharing memes of her father's face superimposed onto ridiculous images. Laura, torn between loyalty and self-preservation, eventually filed for separation, claiming she needed space to process everything. It was a decision that broke Charles further, leaving him utterly alone. By the end of it all, Charles was unrecognizable, not just financially or socially, but emotionally. The man who once strutted through life convinced of his superiority was now reduced to living in a modest apartment, surviving on meager savings. Every knock at the door made him jump, fearing another lawsuit or angry mob. The world had turned its back on him, and for the first time, Charles realized the true cost of his actions. But while justice had been served, redemption seemed impossibly far away. The public shaming of Charles Whitmore reached levels that even the most cynical observers couldn't have predicted. What started as a viral moment quickly snowballed into a full-blown cultural phenomenon, with memes, hashtags, and parodies dominating social media for weeks. The internet had turned Charles into a villainous caricature, a symbol of everything wrong with entitled privilege and unchecked prejudice. His face, frozen in that smug grin as he poured paint on Amir Patel, became the centerpiece of countless mocking images. Some depicted him as a medieval jester throwing buckets of paint instead of jesting. Others photoshopped his expression onto statues or historical figures known for arrogance. Even late-night talk show hosts got in on the action, making jokes about the guy who thought ruining someone's day would make him famous. But beyond the humor lay a darker side to the backlash. Protesters gathered outside Charles's former mansion, holding signs that read "Respect our heroes" and "Privilege has consequences." Strangers shouted insults whenever they spotted him running errands, forcing him to wear hats and sunglasses just to avoid being recognized. Online, comment sections filled with venomous remarks, accusing him of racism, ignorance, and cruelty. People dug up old photos and videos from his past, scrutinizing every detail for signs of toxic behavior. One viral post featured footage of Charles berating a hotel employee years ago, cementing his reputation as someone who treated others poorly when things didn't go his way. Amid this storm, Amir Patel emerged as a beacon of hope and dignity. Interviews with him went viral, showcasing his calm demeanor and thoughtful words. When asked how he felt about Charles's actions, Amir simply said, "I choose not to let hate define me. My duty is to serve with honor, no matter what happens." These words resonated deeply with audiences around the world, inspiring campaigns celebrating diversity within the Royal Guard Corps. A petition calling for more recognition of minority guards gained thousands of signatures, with many citing Amir's story as proof of the need for inclusivity in such prestigious roles. Schools began using the incident as a teaching tool, discussing themes of respect, accountability, and systemic prejudice. Teachers showed clips of the event alongside interviews with Amir, encouraging students to reflect on how small acts of kindness or cruelty could ripple outward. Meanwhile, charities supporting marginalized communities reported spikes in donations, with donors often referencing Amir's grace under pressure as their inspiration. For Charles, however, life grew increasingly unbearable. Every attempt to defend himself only made matters worse. In one ill-advised interview, he claimed he was just having fun and never intended to hurt anyone. The response was swift and brutal, with critics accusing him of minimizing the harm he caused. Another apology video posted online backfired spectacularly after viewers noticed his lack of genuine remorse. Instead of softening hearts, these efforts reinforced perceptions of him as out of touch and unrepentant. Even those closest to him struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the monster portrayed in the media. Laura filed for divorce shortly after moving out, citing irreconcilable differences. Emily distanced herself entirely, refusing to speak to her father unless absolutely necessary. Friends who once fawned over his wealth now avoided him like the plague, afraid of being associated with his tarnished name. Isolated and humiliated, Charles retreated further into obscurity, spending most of his time indoors to escape the judgmental stares and whispered insults. Yet, despite the overwhelming negativity, something unexpected began to emerge: a reluctant conversation about privilege and accountability. While many continued to vilify Charles, others used his story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked entitlement. Columnists wrote pieces exploring why someone with so much would risk it all for a fleeting moment of defiance. Psychologists weighed in, analyzing the mindset of individuals who believe rules don't apply to them. And slowly, painfully, Charles found himself at the center of a broader dialogue, one he neither wanted nor understood but couldn't escape. By the time the frenzy began to die down, Charles's name had become synonymous with arrogance and prejudice. He was no longer just a man who poured paint on a royal guard. He was a symbol of everything society vowed to leave behind. But while the world moved on, Charles remained trapped in the shadow of his own mistakes, wondering if redemption was even possible. Months turned into years, and Charles Whitmore's life bore little resemblance to the one he had once known. The luxurious penthouse was gone, replaced by a cramped studio apartment in a quiet neighborhood where no one recognized him. His designer suits were traded for thrift store clothes, and his days of fine dining were reduced to budget meals cooked on a tiny stove. Every knock at the door sent his heart racing, fearing another confrontation or reminder of his past. He avoided mirrors, not because he disliked his appearance, but because he couldn't stand the shame that washed over him whenever he saw his own reflection. Work was nearly impossible to find. The few employers willing to overlook his infamy often rescinded offers after background checks revealed the full extent of his downfall. Even menial jobs slipped through his fingers when coworkers recognized him and complained about working alongside that guy. Desperation led him to take odd jobs under false names, cleaning offices late at night, stocking shelves in deserted grocery stores, anything to stay afloat. But the loneliness gnawed at him more than the financial struggles. Friends, acquaintances, and even distant relatives had severed ties, leaving him utterly isolated. His family offered little solace. Laura finalized their divorce quietly, choosing not to drag Emily into court battles. She relocated with their daughter to another state, hoping to give Emily a fresh start away from the stigma attached to her father's name. Though Charles tried reaching out occasionally, his calls went unanswered. On birthdays and holidays, he sent cards filled with heartfelt apologies, but they were returned unopened. Each rejection cut deeper than the last, forcing him to confront the reality that he might never repair those broken bonds. As time passed, guilt began to weigh heavily on Charles. Sleepless nights became routine, haunted by memories of the guard's stoic face and the crowd's gasps of disbelief. He replayed the incident endlessly in his mind, wondering what he could have done differently. For the first time, he started reading articles about Amir Patel, not out of anger, but curiosity. He learned about Amir's journey, growing up in a modest household, overcoming prejudice to join the Royal Guard Corps, and becoming a role model for marginalized communities. The more he read, the smaller Charles felt, realizing how selfish and thoughtless his actions had been. In an attempt to rebuild himself, Charles sought therapy, though it was difficult to admit he needed help. At first, he resisted opening up, brushing off questions or deflecting blame onto others. But as sessions progressed, he began to unpack the layers of entitlement and prejudice that had shaped his worldview. It wasn't easy. Some days, he left feeling raw and exposed, questioning whether change was truly possible. Yet there were moments of clarity too, times when he acknowledged the pain he caused and vowed to do better, even if forgiveness seemed unlikely. To make amends, Charles started volunteering at community centers, mentoring troubled youth who reminded him of his younger self. He shared stories of his mistakes, hoping to steer them away from paths of arrogance and disrespect. Though many dismissed him initially, a few listened, seeing glimpses of sincerity beneath his guarded exterior. Slowly, he began earning small measures of trust, finding purpose in helping others avoid the pitfalls that had destroyed his life. Still, redemption remained elusive. Public opinion hadn't softened much. Mentions of his name still sparked outrage online, and strangers continued to glare at him when recognized. Some accused him of performing acts of kindness only to salvage his reputation, dismissing his efforts as insincere. While Charles understood their skepticism, it stung nonetheless, reinforcing the idea that certain wounds could never fully heal. And yet, amidst the wreckage of his former life, Charles discovered something unexpected: humility. Stripped of wealth, status, and pride, he learned to see people not as tools for validation, but as individuals deserving of respect. It wasn't enough to undo the damage he caused, but it marked the beginning of a long, painful road toward understanding. And perhaps, someday, forgiveness. Years after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Charles Whitmore's name still lingered in public memory, though it no longer sparked the same level of outrage. The world had moved on to new scandals and stories, but his actions remained a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly arrogance and prejudice could unravel even the most privileged life. For Charles, however, redemption was an uphill battle that required more than just good intentions. It demanded consistency, humility, and a willingness to face the consequences of his past without excuses. By this point, Charles had carved out a modest existence for himself. He continued volunteering at community centers, working quietly behind the scenes to mentor young people struggling with anger or entitlement. His approach wasn't perfect. Some days, old habits crept back in, and he caught himself snapping at someone who reminded him too much of his younger self, but he kept trying. Over time, a few of the teens he worked with began to see him not as that guy from the news, but as someone genuinely invested in their growth. One boy, in particular, thanked Charles for helping him turn his life around, saying, "You showed me I don't have to be like my dad." Those words meant more to Charles than anything else he'd ever achieved. Publicly, Charles made sporadic attempts to address his past, In interviews with smaller outlets, he spoke candidly about his mistakes, acknowledging the harm he caused while emphasizing the lessons he learned. Some critics dismissed these efforts as performative, accusing him of seeking attention rather than making amends. But others noted the sincerity in his voice, recognizing that true change often came slowly and painfully. Amir Patel, now a senior figure within the Royal Guard Corps, declined to comment when asked about Charles's transformation, choosing instead to focus on promoting diversity and inclusion within the institution he loved so dearly. Amir's career flourished in ways Charles could never have imagined. After retiring from active duty, Amir became a spokesperson for organizations advocating racial equality and representation. Schools invited him to speak at assemblies, where he inspired students with tales of perseverance and dignity. A documentary about his life won awards, shedding light not only on his personal journey but also on the challenges faced by minority guards navigating systemic biases. Though Amir rarely mentioned Charles by name, he often emphasized the importance of responding to hatred with grace, a philosophy that resonated deeply with audiences worldwide. For Charles, closure remained elusive. Despite his efforts, many refused to forgive him, viewing his acts of service as too little, too late. Even Laura and Emily maintained their distance, unwilling, or perhaps unable, to reconcile fully. On rare occasions, Emily sent brief updates via email, sharing milestones like graduations or promotions. Each message ended with a polite but firm reminder: "Dad, you hurt us. Healing takes time." Charles saved every email, reading them over and over, clinging to the hope that someday they might let him back into their lives. Yet, amidst the lingering pain, there were glimmers of progress. Some former acquaintances reached out cautiously, curious about the man Charles had become. They'd marveled at his ability to endure ridicule and rejection without bitterness, noting how far he'd come since those early days of denial and defensiveness. Though trust was fragile, it hinted at the possibility of rebuilding fractured relationships. Ultimately, Charles's story served as both a warning and a lesson. It highlighted the destructive power of unchecked privilege and prejudice, while underscoring the potential for growth, even in the face of overwhelming odds. For Amir, it reinforced the strength found in resilience and compassion. And for the countless strangers who followed their intertwined fates, it offered a mirror to reflect on their own biases and behaviors. In the end, neither man emerged unchanged. Amir carried his dignity forward, inspiring generations to embrace equality and respect. Charles, meanwhile, bore the weight of his mistakes, striving daily to prove that people could evolve, if given the chance. Redemption may not have been guaranteed, but the effort alone stood as proof that humanity, flawed as it was, always held the capacity for change.